Hello, my slide is on the history of slavery. First, we're going to talk about the slaves in Greece. The word slave has an ancient origin. It comes from the medieval Latin scalum or scavum. Most of the slaves were women working as house workers. Men often work in agricultures. In 1800 to 1600, the slave market increased because of the colonization along the Mediterranean. There was four different types of slaves in ancient Greece: house workers, women, slaves in the mines, and slaves on the ships. And then there was two ways that you could become a slave in ancient Greece, whether that was from abandonment and having debt. And then, just like everyone else, they had rights um, and duties. They couldn't fight and they couldn't participate in legislative assemblies, but they couldn't be killed without a trial, and they could not be sold outside their country. But a slave could buy his freedom or their freedom. And in ancient Greece, slaves were treated like property, just like everywhere else. Now we're going to talk about slaves in Egypt. Slaves were sold at the market. Slaves could be children. It didn't matter what age you were. Slaves could be traded for anything other than money. Slaves were brought to Egypt from other lands. Slaves were often given Egyptian names, and slaves were vital to the growth of the Egyptian empire. And then, as you see, there's this chart, and slaves were at the bottom of the social pyramid, as along with farmers. Slaves could gain freedom. They could marry into family, or they could buy their way out of slavery. Slavery during colonization. The African slave trade began as an attempt to fulfill the labor shortage in the Mediterranean region in the early 1700s. Portuguese were the first European slave traders. The Islamic slave trade continued long after the Atlantic slave trade and came to a halt in the late 1800s. The Middle Passage is also known as the Atlantic slave trade. It transferred slaves to the New Worlds. The journey took 4 to 6 weeks. The conditions were bad, and many slaves died on the journey. Europeans fought lustily for slave ports on the West African coast, and many forts changed hands several times during the Atlantic slave trade. Thousands of slaves were brought along by the great Spanish explorers for the late 15th century and early 16th century. Slave in early America. In 1619, the first Africans were brought to the colony of Jamestown, Virginia by the Dutch. The Dutch actually found slaves upon a Spanish ship that they have seized. So as you see here, this is what a normal slave ship would look like. They would be the two bottom decks, and they would all have to sleep on the ground. This is what a plantation would look like, and these are what living conditions were like. They would be multiple families living in these small huts, and a lot of them would be working in the farms, picking cotton. They were compared to animals. They weren't considered humans. They weren't allowed to read or write. They couldn't leave the plantation without the permission of the slave owner. They were beaten almost daily. They weren't allowed to vote. They were treated as property, and they were not allowed to defend themselves as against their owners. Slaves were often punished for misbehaving. Punishment including whipping, branding, beating, sword, gag, and other methods. The slaves during the Civil War and the road to the Civil War. Between 1810 and 1830, the number increased from 700,000 to more than 2 million. New Orleans became nationally important as a slave port by 1840 and had the largest slave market in the country. In 1750, widespread sentiment during the American Revolution that slavery was evil. Massachusetts Constitution declared that all men were equal, and strong support for slavery among white Southerners who profit from it. They referred to it as a particular institution. William Lloyd Garrison wrote The Liberator. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Frederick Douglass was escaped from slavery and wrote an autobiography about his time as a slave. And Harriet Tubman led many slaves along the Underground Railway. So this map basically tells you the different paths that they took. There was some that instead of going all the way up to Canada, they could go to Mexico and gain their freedom. The North and South grew apart when the Baptist Church and others dominance splits into North and South. Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a 60-year-old who sued for his freedom after the death of his owner on the ground that he lived in a territory that slavery was forbidden in the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase, from which slavery was excluded under the terms of the Missouri Compromise. 10 years later, in a sweeping decision which set America on the course for a civil war, Supreme Court denied his freedom. The Dred Scott decision, 6-3, held that a slave could not become free which taken into a free state, Congress could not bar slavery from a territory, and black people could not be citizens. The decision enraged abolitionists and encouraged slave owners pushing to civil war. So this is the Missouri Compromise. So anything north of this, or like this line, even though there are some outliers, but the Missouri Compromise said that any slave that went north of it would become free. The 1860 election, Lincoln, the Republican, won the plenty of popularity and a majority of the electoral votes. Lincoln, however, did not appear in the electoral votes in the South, thus this election splits the country. They also argue that banning slavery in new states would upset what they saw as balance of slave states to free states. The combination of this would lead to the self-seceding and the American Civil War. So this is a map of the votes. Had Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee voted for with the other South, I think there would have been a chance that Lincoln may have not won the election. The American Civil War began in 1861, and it led to the end of slavery. Not long after the war broke out, though, a legal maneuver led by General B. Benjamin F. Butler, a lawyer by profession, any slave who came into the Union were considered contraband to war. Many of the contraband would join the Union Army, forcing entire regiments to colored troops. Lincoln Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863 was a powerful movement. They promised slaves in the Confederacy freedom as soon as the Union Army reached them and authorized the establishment of African American in the Union Army. Emancipation as a reality came into the Confederacy as they had surrendered in spring of 1865. There were still 250 slaves in Texas. Word did not reach Texas of the collapse of the Confederacy until June 19th, 1865. This was the first colored regiment of the American Civil War, and that would have been the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. Modern day slavery. Slavery did not end with abolishment in the 19th century. Instead, it changed forms and continued to harm people in every country of the world. There is forced labor, agriculture and fishing, domestic work, construction, mining, quarrying and brick kilns, manufacturing, processing and packaging, prostitution and sexual exploitation, market trading and illegal activities, death bondage, descent-based slavery, and child slavery. What is human trafficking? It's the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, overseas of people by which means that of threat or use of force of coercion, abduction, of the abuse of power, or of a person, a voluntary, or the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another persons for the purpose of exploitation. And then moral panics around sex trafficking have been used to crack down on other forms of prostitution. Pimps in the U.S. can be convicted of a federal crime with disappointed prison time. I would like to thank Ms. Jameson for letting me using her room.